Welcome, everyone. Hope we're all doing well. My name is Omar, and I'm a member of the Comp Student Council. And along with Eva Lee, we are both going to be co-moderating this event. This is the very first C3 Comp Career Catalyst session of the 2023-24 year. And it's all about residency applications. So if you're applying for residency, you're interested in residency, perfect timing, right? We can now get the inside scoop as to what's happening, what the best practices are. And we have a all-star lineup of folks who just went through this process relatively recently. And so just a quick intro for each of them. We have Dr. Clara Fallone, who is a physicist from the Tom Baker Cancer Center in Calgary. Dr. Haley Patrick, who is a medical physics resident at BC Cancer Vancouver. And Dr. Mark D'Souza, who is a medical physics resident at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center in Toronto. So before we get started, just a quick land acknowledgement. I'm personally located in Toronto, Ontario, and the land acknowledgement that we have here at Toronto Metropolitan University is that Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee. Subsequent indigenous nations and peoples and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I encourage you to, depending on where you are, visit whos.land. It's a website that shows the specific nations on which different places across Canada are situated. And so I encourage you to learn more about where your specific institutions are located as well. So just a brief thing, I mentioned the Comp Student Council. What's that all about? So our mission is that we are a education subcommittee as part of COMP, which is the Canadian Organization of Medical Physicists. And what we're really involved in is student and trainee interests in medical physics for across Canada. And our specific mission statement is that we advise the COMP board through the Education Committee on matters of importance to COMP student members. We assist COMP in attracting and retaining student members. And just a quick note about that, if you're a first-year student, it is free membership. We also organize social, academic, and professional development events like this one for students in the academic year, as well as at the COMP annual scientific meeting. So just now we had that in Montreal. And in a nutshell, we really focus on helping to create a strong student community here in Canada.
Hi, my name is Eva. Just sort of a list of initiatives that we've been doing as a COMP Student Council. First, we had the COMP ASAM student events. So this year we had the Student Night Out, Young Professional Workshop, Canadian Residency Fair, and Science Book and Sanity. And then the second initiative that we had is the Student Spotlight. We share your recent publications, awards, or other accomplishments with the community. So if you have any thing that you want us to share, you can scan the QR code on the right side and then tell us about the thing that you have accomplished. So the third is the COMP Career Catalyst seminars. There's many more, so stay tuned and find out more with us. So for the CQ seminar series, it's a professional development series designed for students and trainees who are interested in enhancing their knowledge and developing skills for success in graduate school and to accelerate a future in medical physics. Next section will be announced on social media and via email. So make sure you follow us on the social media and join the email list by scanning this QR code here. Past sessions are available on YouTube. They are privately listed, so send us email to access them. So just a brief agenda and housekeeping for the seminar today. So we kind of started a little bit late, but we had the 10 minutes opening remarks and then followed by the 10-minute presentation by Dr. Haley, and then another 15-minute presentation by Dr. Clara Fallone. And after that, we had a panel discussion and then Q&A session, and then closing remarks at the end. So please raise your hand to ask a question during the panel or directly message your moderators for your question. This session is being recorded and will be shared on YouTube.
Okay, so as I mentioned, this is the session on residency applications, and let's just get right into it. Our very first speaker is Dr. Haley Patrick. And just a brief bio about Haley. She is a current first-year resident at BC Cancer Vancouver and a recent Ph.D. graduate from McGill University. She was an active participant in the 2023 MedPhys Match, organizing crowdsourced data, conducting surveys, and managing the community Discord. Over to you, Haley.
All right, so thanks. Hopefully you guys can all see my screen. Am I correct? All right, so today I just kind of want to tell you about my match experience in the nutshell, which was last year's match process. For a little bit of background on me, in terms of the context of this, I was applying to both the US and Canadian programs, about 12 overall, and I happened to match with my first choice, which is here at BC Cancer Vancouver. And overall, I would classify myself as a relatively common applicant based on who I was meeting a lot in interviews. I was completing a PhD at the time. I was a Canadian citizen, similar to American citizens, and I had some volunteering and clinical experience to help kind of bolster and boost up my CV. I will also say I am a type A anxious overplanner, so I was definitely very married to spreadsheets and schedules for this entire year process. So keep that in mind as I go through this rest of this talk. So this was what my personal match timeline happened to look like. And what I thought would be a good idea for this presentation would be to actually just walk you guys through this particular timeline, what I was doing at each of these phases, and some recommendations for each individual one of these. So without further ado, let's get into the October-November part of this, which was my application prep part. I hopefully don't need to tell you guys that residency applications tend to be very competitive. A lot of centers really only offer about 20 interview slots overall, which means if it's a very popular program like some of the states, last year they were getting close to 100 applicants for just 1 or 2 positions. Now, fortunately in Canada, because the applicant pool is a little bit smaller, it's closer to maybe about 50%, but that still means that your application is going to have to be in the top 50, top 20% of all the applications these programs receive in order for you to have a good shot at getting an interview. And what that means is that a strong application package is basically essential. When we surveyed people from last year in terms of matched versus unmatched candidates, one of the things that was the most obvious in terms of whether you matched or not was the number of programs or the percent of programs you actually got an interview for out of the ones you applied to. And if you happen to have a good enough application that you would get invited to about half of all those programs, you had quite a good opportunity to be matched. And this doesn't mean that you solved cancer or anything, or your PhD is going to get a Nobel Prize. I would argue a lot of it is just making sure you have a very clear, concise package that highlights your strengths and achievements and doesn't have any mistakes that are obvious within it. So when it comes to these application components, there's 4 main things. There's, of course, your CV. There's your undergraduate and graduate transcripts, which is very nice in terms of you don't have to prep anything for them. And then there's references. And then depending on which programs you're applying to, there's either going to be personal statements, which are when you're applying to states through the centralized MP-RAP system. This is one application package for any center you're applying to. So it's a very general kind of statement about why you want to be a medical physicist. And if you are going through the Canadian system, you actually have to make it personalized because you're going to be directly applying to them. So this is a cover letter that you then email along with the rest of the application package to the program director or whoever you're told to send it to. So I actually do want to take a little bit of time to just touch on all these different components because I would argue these are some of the most important parts of your entire experience in the match. So for the CV, one thing I'm just going to say off the bat is try and find a simple, clean, and consistent format to go with. I really like the one that APM provides as an example on their website, the APM Research Graduate Template. Mine looked very similar to this. The one thing I don't like about that, though, is if you're going to provide any description of a project or role you had, do it in point form because it's going to be a lot easier for people to figure out the main highlights versus trying to read through a block of text. I will also say this is a great recommendation from Dr. Gady from last year's CCC talk. He, as always, for CVs, best to always start with education and then go into the area you want to highlight most. Depending on who you are, this could be awards, this could be work, this could be projects. This is going to be something you're going to have to figure out after you take the time to really reflect on all the things you've done that you're going to be including in your CV. So for myself, my CV ended up looking like this, where I would kick off with my education, and I decided to highlight the clinical projects and involvement I had over the course of my graduate studies first. Then, of course, hopping into honors and awards, which, by the way, travel awards, even if you're just entered in the lottery and you won it, count, throw those in there. And then following up with work experience for me was mainly undergrad co-ops in this particular area. Publications and presentations, I will say here something nice things, separate into papers, orals, and posters in different subsections, and ideally bold your authorship in the author list so they know where to find you. Membership certifications, if you're part of comp, part of ABM, if you did ABR, all great to throw on there. But also if say you have a mouse certificate to work with mice or something during your project, or you got an Ethos certificate, throw that in there as well. And then, of course, wrapping up with anything volunteering involvement you have to do. But one thing I think that is very underrated that I had a really great experience with during interviews was actually throwing in a hobby section at the end. This was, I think, a fun way for people to get a sense of who the heck I was outside of the formal Haley at work. And I actually got some very kind of nice questions going on in the interview process, and it was a little bit better in terms of getting a sense of community there. So really recommend throwing that in. Also, have a draft of this ready by late October is my personal recommendation, because you need reference letters. You need 3 of them, and you need to pick some references that will speak to different things. Basically, your supervisor is mandatory, unless you have a very good reason that you're going to be disclosing to every single program you apply to why they're not one of your references. You need to have them in there. It's a red flag otherwise. The other 2, talking to some kind of people in other programs, it's really nice to have people who can speak to other things. So for me, I had somebody who could speak to my clinical and somebody who could speak to my departmental outreach involvement overall, of course. And if you really do have somebody who can speak to your clinical involvement, that is very, very good to have. But don't pick just anybody. Make sure they're actually going to be able to write you a strong letter. And if they tell you that they're not confident in that, don't take them on as a reference, because you want to have the strongest letters you potentially can. And this is where me saying you need to have a CV ready by the end of October kicks in, because you want to give them a month to actually be able to write you a good letter and not just try and cram one in last minute in the last 24 hours. One other thing I will say is also try and make this letter writing process as easy as possible for them. Obviously, provide that CV draft I was mentioning earlier, but what I find is very useful for anybody I ask to be a reference is make a helper document. This is just a quick thank you for doing this. I'm hoping you can speak to what I'm like in this particular context. And then here is an itemized point-by-point list of everything we've done that I think maybe you can speak to. So for example, my clinical collaborator, I was like, here are the projects we did together. Remember how we tend to attend clinical rounds together. You can speak to how I always show up at clinical rounds. Here are the abstracts and papers we did together, all that kind of stuff. And I think that is a very good way of making sure they're prepped and able to write a reference very easily for you without actually offering to write it for them. So otherwise, when it comes to things like personal statements, cover letters, these are one or the other, basically. The generic cover letter for the MP-RAP system, the personal statement. The biggest thing I'd say is you have to sell your motivations and experience that will make you a prime candidate. And this requires you to be slightly cheesy and slightly overconfident. I find my personal statement now to be kind of on the cheesy side right now, but I think that was one of the strengths of it overall in terms of me being able to get interviews. And one other thing I will say, whether it's for these personal statements or for cover letters, provide an actual hard example. If you're going to say you're a team player, you better dang well provide an example of when you were a team player and not just say it. You have to back it up with evidence. And there's plenty of good topics to cover. These are kind of the most popular ones that were being used from last year's applicants, but you really can't go wrong with talking about why you want to be a medical physicist, your career goals, your skills, or if you had any notable personal background you want to potentially throw in there. And this, and also cover letters, I will say, you will probably end up writing several drafts. I definitely did, and you want to have people you can send these off to and give you feedback on, honest feedback on, so it actually reaches a good quality and there's no kind of flubs, grammatical errors, etc. Cover letters, similar kind of boat, but it has to be personalized to each individual center. The nice thing is that they all follow a pretty standard one-page format, and there are plenty of different resources from basically every university that has a guide on how to write cover letters. These are 3 of the ones I kind of remember checking out when I was writing these. But basically how I went about these is the first paragraph is always, hi, my name's Haley. I want to come to your residency because blank. And this is something you kind of have to write from scratch for each individual center. But for the middle bits where you're kind of presenting reasons why you're going to be a strong candidate, what I ended up doing to just kind of save myself a little bit of time is I had 3 different paragraphs, each kind of talking about a different area of my strengths. And then depending on the program I was applying to, I would pick which 2 of them I thought was best suited for that center. I'd adjust the wording if I needed to be, and I would put that in there. And I could still customize to each individual center without having to rewrite an entire letter outright. And then the final little bit is just, of course, reiterating why you want to work there and thanking them for their consideration. Again, you can write from scratch, but it's going to be a similar template overall for everybody. And once this is all prepped, it comes to be December, and that's when you can actually go about applying. For me, this involved a lot of triple checking, make sure I had everything in, dotting my T's, crossing my I's, all that kind of stuff. And then one thing, despite kind of wanting to relax a little bit in December, it is really good idea if you can during this time to actually work on doing some interview prep overall, because you want to be confident for that. I was really anxious about potentially going into these. So the different ways of interview prep areas I'm thinking about talking about is, for instance, there are various comic generic interview questions. Tell me about yourself is asked at basically every interviews. Your career goals, 5-year and long term, and why do you want to go to this program? Why do you want to do MesPhys? You should have answers to these ready to go because you should expect them for basically every single interview. And then a lot of interviews also include some kind of behavioral question, basically asking, how did you handle a previous difficult situation? The common ones I can remember off the top of my head are things like an interpersonal issue, an ethical issue, heavy workloads. And it pays off to kind of think of potential scenarios you can talk about for these in advance so you're not racking your brains in the interview and sweating. Now, the thing that was the bane of my existence for interviews was talks. A lot of different programs will ask you to give a talk on your research or topic of interest. It's not to judge the quality of your research, it's just to see what your comfort is like as a speaker, but they vastly ask for different ranges of times. I was asked for 5-minute up to 25-minute long presentations. If you have time over the holiday break, prep a 7-minute one, prep a 15-minute one, and then you can tailor them to fit to whatever length they're asking you for, because that will save you so much time compared to what I was going through. If you're worried about technical questions, from surveying people in our year, only about 50% of the programs were actually asking them. But based on my experience, I found that just reviewing these 4 chapters, the Pogorsak IAEA textbook, which you can get as a PDF online, and the TG51, basically covered me for everything I was pretty much asked for any kind of technical question going on. And if it's the holidays, if you're getting gifts from your family, maybe ask to see if you have enough interviewing outfits, because some weeks you might have 2 or 3 interviews and you don't necessarily want to be doing laundry every second day. And in terms of actually practicing for the interviews, the biggest piece of advice I can give you guys is practice saying those freaking answers out loud. It makes you get very confident and comfortable if you flub some words or having to think a little bit. And you'll get better at being used to trying to keep yourself on topic and wrapping up all of your different answers with a nice conclusion statement to summarize how you're going about it. I ended up practicing a lot with a timer, so I got very used to delivering relatively concise answers in the 1 to 2 minute camp and trying to keep myself from rambling off, which I think is a very valuable thing overall. I will also say, in terms of preparing for these, do not prep scripts, prep point-for-point answers. You do not want to sound rehearsed in these. You want to talk naturally. And if you happen to forget a point, you forget a point. If you forget something in a script, that might throw you off a whole lot more. So this is where I feel like it's valuable. Just don't put the effort into writing an entire script. And if you can, absolutely find an absolute BAMF of a friend like Esteban for myself, who basically offered to mock interview me, took my CV, and then made an entire formal virtual interview for me. And we did this twice through, where he would actually ask me some interview questions and gave me some good, solid, concrete feedback in terms of how well I did for both times. So if you have somebody like this in your life, please take the opportunity, because I cannot thank him enough for doing this for me. And once you're kind of all getting into this and you start getting invitations, you should feel relatively comfortable. For our year, it was pretty much all virtual for these interviews. It might be a little bit different for you guys this year, but if you're doing virtual interviews, it pays to kind of figure out where you want your space to be. And it also pays to make sure your lighting is going to be pretty good. For me, I just took desk lamps and I used some nice cheap thin paper in front, and it worked pretty well as a cheap ring light. So I would highly recommend if you're trying to figure that out. I will also say that you really should be preparing for each individual program in advance. For me, this took the form of looking up the interviewers once I was sent the list and the timeline for that, and then also always coming with at least 2 to 3 questions I was planning to be asking. And one thing I kind of liked and got in the habit of halfway through the interviewing process was having a couple of questions I was just asking every single program, and I would jot down their responses, and then I could compare them and get a sense of which programs I liked their answers more and which ones I didn't. And that gave me a sense of where I thought I might want to go. And speaking of that, just take notes throughout the day. If you have good impressions of people, bad impressions, something about the program structure you like or don't like, jot it down. And it's very valuable. Just at the end of the day, some of these interviews can go on for 8 hours. It's a long time sometimes, but it's important to kind of just take a time, reflect for like 15 minutes, jot down your impressions, or if you happen to have friends who are interviewing that day too, just hop on a Zoom call afterwards and shoot the shit with them and see what they thought as well, what their experience was like. And I think it's just incredibly valuable to kind of get a sense and digest your thoughts on the actual day, and so you don't forget it. And that means when it comes to March, the actual ranking time, this is arguably kind of one of the more anticlimactic ones. It felt relatively straightforward. Big thing I will say though is don't base it on anything other than what you want. A lot of programs will send an email like, we thought you were a great candidate and we will rank you very highly. They sent that to literally everybody that they're going to rank with the exact same wording. Don't be fooled by that and sway you to put them further up your list. Similarly, if your friend says they really, really want to go to BC Cancer Vancouver and you thought you did too, but you want to be nice to them, don't. You both put it as first, because at the end of the day, pick what you want. For me, I ended up making a very preliminary gut checklist based on my initial ranking, and I submitted it relatively early just to make sure I wouldn't match the deadline for when I would put in ranks, and then I tailored it a little bit closer to the deadline when I had more time to think about it. But I think this is a good way, and it doesn't tend to change too much based on talking to other friends who've done this. So I think a gut checklist is a good way to start. And for me, in terms of things that affected my final list, I would say these were relatively common across people. But one thing to definitely keep in mind, especially if you're potentially going to another place where you need a visa, is when is your defense going to be scheduled if you have to defend? Mine was at the end of May, and I had to kind of consider how would that align with start dates for programs and then how long visa processing happened to be. So I took that into account a little bit when I was making my rankings. But with that, I recognize I'm probably pretty close to time. So I kind of just want to conclude with my main personal advice is at the end of the day, I think it just really pays to prepare. Take the time to prep a quality application package because that's what you need to get into those interviews, and take the time so that you're going to be comfortable in those interviews so you can put the best you forward in them. And in that camp, just take advantage of all the available resources and the connections you happen to have in your network. If you are able to go to the residency fair for comp or for APM, or just access the resources in general, do it. And then also, I cannot recommend enough going to the Google Docs spreadsheet, which is just a massive active community, which I was definitely married to this entire point in time. Great in terms of figuring out updates, impressions, and things going on with programs, as well as our year also sorted a Discord channel, which we've opened up to this year as well, if you guys happen to want to join for more communication. And just in general, I think one of the favorite things was just being able to connect with other applicants and making new friends. I met both Claire and then Mark, who's on this panel right now through the match process. 10 out of 10 recommend doing this. This was probably one of the most fun parts of the process, and that's something I would recommend, is just try and find the fun in this, even if there's stress. And with that, thank you so much, and I will pass it over for Clara.
Okay, thanks for Dr. Halleck's presentation. It's really helpful. And just a quick bio for Clara. She did her Ph.D. at University of Alberta on optimizing magnetic resonance spectroscopy pulse sequences for fat quantification. She's a recent graduate of the residency program at Nova Scotia Health. During her residency, she commissioned the novel Ethos HyperSight Halcyon. She's currently a physicist at Tom Baker Cancer Center in Calgary. She doing a lot of brachy and commissioning of MR for the new cancer center. So now let's welcome Dr. Clara Fallone for the presentation.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. Can you hear me, everyone?
Yep.
Excellent, perfect. Okay, and then let me know when you can see my screen. Did everybody see the screen?
Not yet. Give it a
Not
sec,
yet?
maybe.
1 second.
Yeah, now we see it.
Perfect, great, awesome. Thanks so much for inviting me to speak today. And I'll be following up from Dr. Patrick's talk, which had a lot of really great information. So we're talking about residency programs today and the residency experience in general. So I finished my residency officially March of 2023. I wrote my exams, passed thankfully, and now I'm working as a physicist. So I'm just going to start with a bit of an agenda. So I did want to talk a little bit about the expectations of residency, because I think this is a good time to kind of give students that, so that you have a bit of a heads up and you can go in with your best foot forward. Then I'll talk a little bit about the residency program itself, and they're typically very similar to each other. Applying for residency, which Dr. Patrick already gave a lot of really great tips. I've got some interview tips as well. And then just some general guidelines moving from a student to a professional. For a lot of medical physics students, this is perhaps your first professional position. So, just some guidelines and things that will hopefully help you in your career so that you don't have to learn them the hard and embarrassing way. And if at any time you want to ask questions, just feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so with residency, the expectation here is to gain clinical experience. So, we come out of, a lot of us have done a PhD, if not a master's. So we come out of this research brain space. But really with residency, you want to gain that clinical experience. That's the purpose. That's what it's designed to do. So it's a little bit of a switch in your brain. Research is often has very long-term goals where you need to kind of set your own deadlines and so forth in order to achieve your research. Typically, your time is very flexible, generally, depending, of course, on what kind of experiments you're doing. But generally, you're really in charge of your own time. The clinic is completely different. There's a lot of day-to-day expectations and day-to-day deadlines. And often your time really is not as flexible because you have clinical duties. And you're really letting down your team and patients, frankly, if, for example, something comes up during a day and you can't make it to work, it just becomes a lot more complicated. So usually residency is 2 to 3 years. Most programs are 2 years. Some of them are 3 or 4 years. Typically, they have a larger research component, if that's the case. You definitely want a residency that's CAMPEP accredited, because that just means you'll be recognized for the residency that you did. There are bridging programs and whatnot if you've done your studies in a different country and so forth. But I think for the majority of the people in this room, if you're coming out of a PhD or master's program, you'll be looking for a CAMPEP accredited residency program. And of course, the big exam, the CCPM exam. So this is something that you really want to start thinking about at the start of your residency. You'll see that residency can go by pretty fast and it can get pretty busy. And the entire duration of your residency, you're learning things, and all of those things are actually very applicable to your CCPM exam. So the advice I give new residents at the Tom Baker, where I currently work, is all of the documents that you read, like your AAPMTG reports, your CPQR documents, all of those documents, act like it's the last time you're going to read them. So prepare notes, organize your notes, document things properly so that you don't necessarily have to go back and read them again. When you come towards, closer towards the exam, you'll be really thankful that you did that. Okay, so that's some advice to give to you as well. So day 1 of residency, start prepping for that exam. There's a lot of questions that you can do that are basic physics questions that you can prep right away. And, as you go through different rotations in your residency, you can access the CCPM exam questions and start working on those as well. Okay. So the residency program, you have to do at least 2 years of residency before you can write your exam. They take that very seriously. If you're missing even 1 week, they won't let you write the exam. Okay, so make sure that when you're considering, when to start residency and whatnot, if you do have flexible start times, make sure that you know that you need to have at least 2 years of residency before you can write the CCPM exam. And that exam is usually mid-March is the written exam. And then if you pass the written exam, the oral is in May, usually. So the residency program itself, most programs are very similar. They're usually a series of like rosters or units. So for example, there's one on QA, there's one on treatment planning, radiation safety, stereo, brachytherapy. If you have like site-specific techniques like gamma knife or MRL, you'll have that as well. You might do a little bit of teaching. I did that as a resident. But generally, it's very similar across the board. If you are joining a CAMPEP accredited residency program, then you will be exposed to everything that you need to be exposed to. Usually you'll have some kind of clinical research project or clinical project of some sort. Again, it's clinical oriented. So for example, for me, I was heavily involved in commissioning the Ethos HyperSight, as Eva mentioned. And I also did some work on SBRT, single fraction lung SBRT margins. Typically, depending on your center, you'll have some kind of unit exam, and usually it'll be oral in order to get you prepping for the oral CCPM exam. Every center is different in this case. Some might only have it at the end of a unit. Some might have just periodic exams. Not the funnest part of residency, but very necessary. So prepare yourself for that. And again, as I mentioned before, really, you're always preparing for that CCPM exam as you go through your residency training. So Dr. Patrick talked a lot about applying for residency. So I'll just try to parse through my own experience and hopefully not just repeat things that she said. So I think she talks a lot about the match program. I actually didn't do the match program. With the way my when I finished my Ph.D. in January of 2021, and there was a residency position available in Halifax for March. So I ended up taking that one, which made a lot of sense, because if I had waited to do the match program, then I wouldn't be finished my residency now. I would still be studying for my exam. So it enabled me to finish basically a year earlier, which is really nice. So, you know, that is something to consider. The match program obviously gives you a lot of options and whatnot, and you learn a lot from the experience, as Dr. Patrick said. But yeah, for me, it was a more of a priority to, you know, just not spend 6 months unemployed and just to use my skill right away and be able to finish my residency. And I also really enjoyed Halifax. It was a great center to work at. Learned a lot there. You know, would have been a great choice if it were part of the match program. So that worked out really well for me. As I mentioned before, you need at least 2 years of residency before you write your exam. So make sure you're aware of that. And then when you're looking at residency programs, look at the program itself. So some residency programs are very structured compared to others. There are some programs where every week, almost every day, what you'll be doing that day is like predetermined. And then there's other residency programs where it's very much left to the resident to kind of structure their own time and prioritize what projects they'd want to work on, for example. So depending on, you know, your personality, your strengths and weaknesses, do think about that when you're choosing a program. Larger and smaller centers. So I was at a center where I was the only resident, which, you know, I missed some of that mentorship from other residents. But at the same time, there was no competing with other residents. At some of the larger centers where there's, you know, 10 residents, people tend to compete against each other. That some people really thrive in that environment, other people don't. So again, knowing yourself and what kind of environment you thrive in and what you do well in, you know, use that information and make sure that you're applying to residencies that you think you will do well in, right? And then, of course, specific technologies. So every residency program is going to have the bread and butter, the, you know, linear accelerator, CT simulator. But obviously some centers are going to have more specialized technologies. So if there's something that's really interests you, like CyberKnife, then you'll have to be more particular about where you apply. But keep in mind that you don't need to see CyberKnife and Gaiman knife and all of these very specialized technologies in order to pass your exam and be a good physicist. You know, the accreditation is set up such that you know, it's nice to see all of those different technologies, but it's not necessary in order to pass your exams and go forward. So when you're applying for residency, as Dr. Patrick already touched on, you know, you're highlighting your professional and your academic skills. So she talked a lot about that, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much longer. You know, it's very important to pay attention to your soft skills now that you're applying for a professional role. multidisciplinary collaboration and communication is very important in our field. I always hear stories about so-and-so was a brilliant physicist or so-and-so was a brilliant radiation oncologist, but impossible to work with. So, you know, it's obviously great to be brilliant, but you need to be able to also work with your colleagues and collaborate with people. I find as you're going through even, you know, your interviews or even just the language on your CVs and in your cover letter, you know, use that or pay attention to even the term multidisciplinary, right? That you collaborate with your colleagues who are from different disciplines. You're able to communicate with them, and that'll probably help you a lot, not only in landing a residency position, but also using that in your career will help you a lot. As Dr. Patrick was talking about, the cover letters and the CVs are really important. I've heard residency directors say that they may not even read the cover letter, but if it's not there, they definitely notice. So make sure you have one. Make sure you make it specific to the institution you're applying to, and do a good job of it, because you know, somebody might read it, somebody might not, but you don't want to take that chance, right? So definitely still spend time on the cover letter. I know it's a bit of a skill that is losing, or how do you say it? It's losing popularity in our day and age, but it's still very important to have it. People will notice if you don't include it. And yes, make sure to tailor it to the center you're going to. All right, so I just had a few tips here for the interviews. It's the interviews themselves. So you want to be pleasant but professional. It's okay to maybe crack a joke here and there, but keep everything very professional. You know, you can ask about, you know, how are things going? Like, yeah, a little bit better than small talk, but don't get into too much into pop culture, and don't talk too long about things that are not, you know, related to the interview, if that makes sense. You don't want to leave the interview, leaving your interviewers feeling like you just talked a whole bunch about Game of Thrones or something. Pay attention to your attire. I think there was a conference I was at, I think it was the Quebec conference, where a lot of the students and people in general were wearing sweats and whatnot and flip-flops. And we all know it doesn't matter in terms of your skill and your ability. But unfortunately, people do judge you for what you're wearing. And especially now that you're going to be working in a clinic, there have been physicists I've talked to where they've had to talk to their staff because they were wearing certain clothes, and then patients were like, who's that person in the machine room? Like, what are they doing there? You know, they don't look professional, like that's a criminal or whatever. So it's just, again, it has nothing to do with skill, but try to have professional attire, because it does make a difference in our society. And you don't want to, you know, you don't want to miss out on an opportunity because you didn't wear the right clothes. So just give yourself the best chance possible. I always like to bring a notebook and pen. I find that a lot of times, if you look really engaged, so don't have your face in the notebook the whole time, still look at your interviewers. But if you kind of show that you're jotting down a note here and then, it kind of shows some engagement. And then if there is something that I should follow up with, so for example, maybe one of my questions, my answer wasn't completely what I wanted it to be, but I said, you know what, I'm going to look up, I'm going to look into this and follow up. Then I write it down so I make sure I don't forget. Okay. As Dr. Patrick said, practice your interview questions. That is so important. Just being able to speak smoothly, having answers, you know, on the top of your head. You can find very common behavioral interview questions online even. You don't even have to pay for them. They're often very HR type, very similar questions across the board. So you can definitely have some answers prepared for those. And then you'll feel a lot more confident, and your answers will just come off a lot more smoothly, which will help you. So the HR group always recommends the STAR style interview. So for example, if somebody gives you a question like, you notice that a mistake was made on a patient plan, how did you handle this? It's always a good structure to think about this, to address the situation, the task, the action, and the result. Okay, so for example, situation, mistake was made. Task, okay, we need to correct the mistake. We need to talk to the person who did it. We need to make sure that, it's recorded, that do we need to compensate for the patient treatment at all, et cetera, et cetera. The action, okay, in order to prevent this from happening in the future, what kinds of checks or whatnot do we need to implement, and the result. So the result is we have this new check, and hopefully this will prevent this from occurring in the future. So anyways, my answer there wasn't very good because I was doing it at the top of my head. But essentially, if you use that structure, it's typically very effective. And notice too that, even though my answer wasn't very good there, I didn't throw any colleagues under the bus. Okay, so that's really important. If we say something like, hey, we noticed that there's been a lot of mistakes in this QA process, just saying, well, the people doing it are dumb and should be fired is usually not the answer that people want to hear. Typically, they want to see that you're able to think about systemic change. So like, why are these mistakes occurring? How can we prevent them from occurring from a systems point of view? That being said, there are questions, for example, like give an example of a conflict you've had with someone. Don't let your answer just be, I've never had a conflict. They need to know that you're able to deal with conflicts one-on-one as well. So even if you haven't had a conflict at work, think about a conflict you've had at some point in your life and how you dealt with it appropriately. As Dr. Patrick said, it's really good to have broad technical knowledge at hand. I think it's very typical to be asked things like how to draw a PDD, a typical electron treatment. You don't want to feel like a fool for not knowing something very basic from medical physics. And I think, as Haley said, if you read a few chapters of Con, you basically have that covered. So make sure to do that as well. All right, so I had here just some general tips moving from student to professional. So again, just because for some students, this is their first professional role, your presence in the clinic is actually important. So as a student, depending on where you work, it might be typical that no one really cares if you ever show up to the institution or not. As long as you get your work done, you submit your papers, you get good grades, like no one's really watching. It is very different with the clinic. Not only do you have clinical duties that require your presence in the clinic, but also our presence as physicists in the clinic is important. So even though there's a lot of work that you probably could do from home, most clinics will require you to be at work at least the majority of the time, just to have that clinical presence with the rest of the clinical staff. Okay, so that's something to be aware of. And I know as a resident, you'll still be doing a lot of QA and whatnot, which is after hours. And usually the expectation is not just that you work 16 hours every day, but typically, for example, my former residency supervisors had told me that if I end up doing some QA and I need some time off, just to make sure to let them know so that they're aware that I won't be in the clinic, and that if people ask where I am, they can say where I am. So be ready for that. It is a little bit of a shift. Engage with all the hospital staff. You have no idea how many radiation therapists tell me that they adore me because I just say hi to them. It's just that easy. Just saying hello, how are you? I'm Clara. Introducing yourself. It's really easy, and it goes a long way. Another thing to remember is that you now represent the hospital and also the medical physics field. Okay. So we're always looking, for example, in presentations and whatnot, for ways we're trying to engage our audience. maybe ways to be funny, ways to set ourselves apart, but you need to be really careful. You know, if there's a joke or something, you're unsure the hospital is going to be happy to say it, just don't say it. It's better to be safe. And you don't want to start off your career by, you know, saying something that offended someone and having complaints lodged against you. So just remember that you are in a professional field, and you are representing the profession, and you're no longer a student. So you know, nobody's going to defend you on that front. So do behave professionally when you're engaging with your colleagues. Behave professionally. Don't throw other colleagues under the bus. Don't badmouth whatever other groups of other disciplines or other groups of people or physicists working elsewhere. So just remember that, you know, you are a professional now, so make sure you behave that way, and your colleagues will appreciate that as well. Okay, and that was all that I have for you guys.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Fallone and Dr. Patrick, for your presentations. So now we will move on to the panel discussion. So hopefully you've all had nice time to think up of some good questions, even though those answered a lot of questions that I personally had for sure. But before we get into that, I do want to formally introduce our panelist as well, Dr. Mark D'Souza. So Dr. Mark D'Souza is a first-year physics resident at the Odette Cancer Center at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center here in Toronto. He acquired his BSc from the University of Waterloo, where he was enrolled in the Honors Cooperative Life Physics program. After this, Mark completed his Ph.D. in the CampEp accredited medical physics program at Toronto Metropolitan University, or TMU, where his research focused on water calorimetry for novel radiotherapy techniques. So Mark is also here with us today. So if you have questions, please feel free to either enter them in the chat or just raise your hand in classic Zoom fashion, and we will get to the questions asked. And this is just to everyone. So the question here from myself is, and Dr. Fallone and Dr. Patrick, you both touched on this, how to pick a center. You know, there's tons of different centers out there. You may interview at a lot of different places. How do you choose where you want to go? And, you know, specifically how you rank these places. So the question I have is, for yourselves, what were the different green flags or possibly even red flags that you had for these different centers?
Dr. Fallone, do you want to go first?
Sure.
And just before you continue, I just also want to point out, Dr. Fallone, your screen is still sharing as well.
Yes, I'm trying to figure out how to go back to, 1 second. There we go. Thank you.
Perfect.
Let me undo it now. Okay, I'm no longer sharing, I believe, right?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, so, you know, I would say green flags, red flags. I think the interview itself will often say a lot. If you're walking away from the interview feeling like you really enjoyed talking to the people there, like they were really nice and engaging and whatnot, that's generally a good sign. Remember that the interview is a conversation, really, right? So like they're interviewing you, but you're also interviewing them, right? So if you feel like, oh yeah, I think I could work with these people, they seem, you know, they seem really collaborative and good, then that's typically a good sign. Did the interviewers bother to look at your CV, right? Did they see a little bit about your research? I mean, maybe didn't read it super thoroughly, but you know, they may have had a couple questions about your work as well, which shows some interest, which I think is a good sign. I'm trying to think of, I'll be honest with you that I feel like physicists in Canada, it's a great field and there's not a lot of red flags. So,
I mean, I can speak to a red flag I personally did not enjoy, which was a senior member of a program making jokes about a resident stress crying on shift, making a joke about it. That was a massive red flag to me that they were normalizing that. And I did not rank that center.
Yeah, that is a huge red flag.
Mhm.
Huge red flag. I have luckily never experienced that. But yeah, I would not appreciate, any sort of jokes about gender, race, mental health, anything like that would probably be a very big red flag, I think, for most people. Or it should be.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I would agree very much with Dr. Fallone. Vibes, it was a huge thing for me in terms of like my top 5, basically vibes right off the bat, and then nickel and diming between those top 5s was then you're going into the nitty gritty in terms of I like this structure more, I like this location more. But very clearly you'll have packs of good vibes, vibes, so bad vibes, and then you'll just nickel and dime from there basically. But you want to enjoy yourself for the 2 to 4 years you're going to be there. Simple as that.
Yeah, and I think too, on that note, this didn't happen to me, but I do know of fellow physicists, female ones, who were asked what their plans for children were, which
they are not allowed to ask you that.
It's not,
they're not allowed to ask you that, and you can technically report them for that.
It's difficult to handle that situation when you're in it. But in I think this person, in 2 of the cases, there was someone else in the room who was like, don't answer that question. So someone from the institution that was doing the interviews basically stepped in and was like, no, you don't need to answer that. So they knew that it was inappropriate. But yeah, I think that happens more commonly in the US.
I think certain centers through the grapevine, there's 1 or 2 people from centers from certain centers in the US that get unfortunately known as the notorious interviewer who will ask that.
Yeah, which is really, really unfortunate. So how you want to choose to handle that question, if you even still want to go to the center, I think those are very personal decisions, but you have every right to report that center for asking questions like that. And yeah, I think, what I had said before, just think about the type of center you want to work in, right? So some of my colleagues thrive on competition. They want to be in a competitive center. Other people don't. So think about things like that, right? And think about, so for example, my research is in MRI. So working at the Tom Baker Cancer Center in Calgary, I really wanted to make sure I could still continue some work on MRI. So there might just be very simple interests that you have as well.
Well, thank you for answering the questions. We got 1 question from the audience. It's in the chat. It says that on the same topic of references, how did you select which people to ask for references? Did you try to grab a more diverse set of references or focus on 3 people within the very recent clinical plus research?
So I'll speak to this. I ended up speaking to somebody who was on an interview panel in the States a little bit on that. Supervisor, again, as I'm saying, your supervisor has to be a reference unless you literally have the best possible reason that you're going to disclose to everybody why they are not an appropriate reference. So that's one. That's going to basically be speaking to your research. And then because you're arguably going into a clinical environment, you want to ideally have 1 person who's not a medical physicist. So it will most likely end up being somebody who's on the clinical team at your training center during graduate studies that can speak to you. And that is, again, if they can speak well to you and in enough detail to you in terms of how quality you are in there, that is, I think, a very strong person you do want to have. And then the third one, I think that's where you're going to kind of have to figure out what that third camp is going to be. For myself, like I mentioned, I picked somebody who was a medical physicist in the department who just could speak to the amount of involvement I kind of had in the department. But if you can kind of spread it out in terms of showing off yourself as a well-rounded person through what your resident references can talk about, I think that's really valuable. And then also just because we're talking about references, and Owen had a little bit of a question about that earlier, about the format of reference letters. It really depends. So the MP RAP system, they write a reference letter and they upload it into that. The Canadian system, it could vary between all of them, but overall, I would say if your references have a reference letter that's prepared and ready to go by the start deadlines of your applications, that should cover stuff. certain programs might have a form where they have to answer certain things, but I think for the most part, they're just looking for reference letters. But I can't speak to that because I'm not a program director.
Just piggybacking off of what Dr. Patrick said as well. So I had my references, I picked them in kind of a similar way. So one was my supervisor, and then the other one I picked because I'd been involved in the clinic with them so they could speak to that. And for my third one, I picked someone within the university who could speak more to my academic, I guess, record, and as well as my involvement in the university. So that's how I personally structured it. But again, your mileage might vary on the last one as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go to Liam. Liam has his hand up for a question.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, just thanks to all the panelists for joining, and thanks to Dr. Patrick and Dr. Fallone for the talks. Those were like really informative. So yeah, I just had, I guess, one question for all the panelists and one for Dr. Patrick. So for all the panelists, how do you go about structuring your research talks for the interview? I mean, like, sort of what do you want to highlight? I guess what's the purpose of the talks from the perspective of the panel sort of evaluating you? And then I guess for Dr. Patrick, you said about like being cheesy in your personal statement. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that?
So I guess it's when I tend to be relatively humble talking about myself and my accomplishments. I am not somebody who likes to brag very often, so I tend to downplay things a decent amount. So when I'm talking about the personal statement, it's a little bit stronger language than I would tend to use talking about myself. Like, I am a driven individual who is very motivated to do X, Y, and Z. It becomes stronger language that I would commonly use to refer to myself. And you're not going to use too many fluffy adjectives, but you're sounding a little bit more like inspirational, motivational speaker speech style, I guess, is a little bit how I felt mine kind of came across, where it's, yeah, I am the best person. I'm hyping myself up. I'm not overhyping, but I'm my own hype man, is the kind of way it ended up coming across to me now when I'm reading it. But I think you do need to be, for lack of better words, a little bit of your own hype man. Don't go too far, but you do have to talk yourself up.
Yeah, a little more than you might in normal life.
Yeah, I think it tends to be Canadians tend to not be as good at that, I feel like.
Yeah, yeah.
You gotta play ball. So you gotta be a little more kind of overconfident there.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks.
And then I'll let maybe Mark and Clara first go into kind of talking about talks, and then
I guess I can go first, but yeah, so I also had kind of a similar experience with talks ranging from 5 to 25 minutes, I think was also the maximum one. And so again, I'm like, I was just someone that applied. I can't speak at a program director level, but to me, it was if you could communicate your research, is just see if you can communicate this complex idea that, you know, kind of makes sense to you. You've been working on it for 4 years or 5 years during your PhD. And if you can communicate that effectively to a group that perhaps knows nothing about your research. So it's how well you can communicate it. And so typically, like with the shorter presentations, you really don't have a lot of time. And I remember what I was told was it's fine to be under, but definitely don't go over. And so I would really just focus on like a single kind of concept or single project that I had during my PhD, and really focus on the introduction and methods, because it's, you know, people don't necessarily understand what water calorimetry is used for. And for the longer ones, I honestly just treated it like a mini defense, because our defense was supposed to be 20 minutes anyway. So that was good practice on that front. But yeah, I guess that would be my 2 cents on it. Just make sure that you're communicating it effectively, and make sure you practice it beforehand, and try not to sound too scripted.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's really important, is don't go over. You know, make sure, try to keep your talk engaging, right? So it's definitely better to be under, and you are presenting to scientists, so you do need to show science and good science. But keep in mind, try to keep it a little lighter and a little less technical so that people can follow.
Sounds good. Thanks so much.
Well, we go to our next question from Andrew. Andrew,
Hey,
I
can
think
you
you
hear
are
me?
muted. Yes, we can hear you
Okay,
now.
sweet. All right, so I just had a quick question for all the panelists. There's fantastic information so far, pretty great insight. Just something small. So you're talking about how in the interview process with the residency programs, you're expected to ask them questions at some point. So I was just wondering, how many questions do they usually give you time or opportunity to ask? Because you said like have 2 or 3 ready, but do you normally get to ask all of those, or is it something separate?
The short is it depends. In my experience, it was basically a lot of interviews for this year's match was kind of, you would go to small kind of breakout rooms with 1 or 2 people, and you would rotate through like 2 to 6 of those sometimes, depending on the center. And so they would typically ask you 2 or 3 questions in each breakout room, and then they would try and schedule to have 5 minutes at the end for you to be able to ask your own questions. But depending on how long you took to answer your questions, you might not get that time at all. You might only get half the time. You might get the full time. So preparing and that's where I'm just like having 1 question bare minimum, I think you should have. But depending on the time you have, and maybe certain people will be able to speak better to certain things than others, have a couple just so like pretty much everybody will ask you if you have the time, do you have any questions for me? And you don't necessarily want to sit there and be like, nope, and then just sit awkwardly for the next 3 minutes as you wait for that session to wrap.
Yeah, I found just to echo off that, for me, like I usually had 2 to 3 questions, and oftentimes like would only get the chance to ask maybe 1, just because we kept running over. But there were times I got to ask all of them. But after 3 as well, I think I very rarely had time to ask a 4th one. So I would just say 2 to 3 is a good number to have. And also, like, you can ask, I know for me, one of my questions was like different people answering it would change would answer it in different ways. And so, especially in those interviews where you're interviewing with each member of the department individually, I found that I could just often repeat the question. But again, that's a personal preference, and you may not want to do that. But that also, it also does help though if you look up who your interviewers are beforehand. Because in that way you can, maybe there's something about you want to work with them and their research interests you, and it's a chance to ask them about it, and it's a chance for them to know, oh, this person's actually interested in coming here.
So just to build off of that question, just to follow up, would these questions generally be something like about the center, something like, describing the work culture, or would they be something a little more specific about the interviewer and their experience at a certain place?
I would say it depends, honestly. If you've done the research on the interviewers and there's a specific interviewer focused question you want to ask them, you ask them that. But then a lot of the time it tends to be more, you want to get a general sense of the program. Maybe you're asking that particular person's impression of a certain aspect. Maybe you're just asking them overall. But it's going to come down to you and what you think is important.
Okay, awesome. Braden has a question as well.
Thank you.
All right. So I guess just to start, I apologize. I am kind of crashing this as a resident myself at the moment. I guess old habits kind of die hard when I like trying to get involved in a lot of these community events. But I guess for the panelists, and apologies if this may be something Dr. Patrick brought up early on. I wasn't able to attend the first half hour or so. But are there any particular skills you think help transition you from the PhD to the residency field? I guess, for example, for myself, I really struggled with the first couple weeks, really adapting to having to multitask quite a bit. As a PhD student, you're kind of expected to be the expert in your field and pursue a single research objective. Whereas in residency, there's quite a few different tasks to follow. So I guess if the panel have any thoughts on that, that'd be great, I think.
I think you hit the nail on the head with time organization. But otherwise, I think it's as Dr. Flynn was really great about bringing up earlier. Interpersonal soft skills is a big thing. Like time management, interpersonal soft skills, I think are great things to have. Admittedly, those are things you develop over the entire course of your life, though. But if you try and get a handle on them the last year of your degree, not a bad thing.
Yeah, it's tough to explain how to learn those things. But I think a really great place to start when you're doing, for example, a lot of students do QA, and I saw the students at my centers do this. They would just show up at the unit, walk in, start doing QA. It takes like a whole 20 seconds to just say hello to the therapist and introduce who you are. That's maybe an easy way to start. Just start by, hello, this is who I am. I'm from physics. And already there, that's like opening up that line of communication and people know who you are. So I think that's already a very maybe small, easy step to take. I'm trying to think on the spot here of how else to provide guidance, but it's a little bit tough to learn it. But I think, again, like if I just think of what's really simple, you get into the physics department in the morning, say hello to your colleagues. Hi, good morning. Don't be kind of just hiding in your office, hoping nobody notices you, right? I think that's just a very easy way to kind of have people know who you are and hopefully start those lines of communications. But if anybody has more concrete examples of how to learn those skills, but that's all I can really think of right now.
Yeah, at the end of the day, it's hard to say how you learn them, but you will pretty quickly figure out what you need to work on once you get started.
Would networking fall under one of like just these kind of soft skill building sort of exercises, just going to conferences, talking to people you don't know, and just sort of building those kind of soft skills in that sense?
Absolutely. Go to a conference, go to a bunch of people standing together and interject and introduce yourself. Introduce yourself to people you've never met before. Hi, I'm so-and-so. I work at this center. I'm in my whatever year of a PhD student. That's a really great start. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for all the advice from the panelists. We move on to the next question. I think we have Hurley. Sorry if I said your name wrong.
That's okay. Thanks. I think I actually just saw that somebody else asked a similar question in the chat, but I'm coming at maybe a different perspective. Maybe you guys can speak to this. I'm somebody who had a PhD previously and have entered into the CAMPEP accreditation, so I have a relevant PhD background, but I'm kind of coming at it from a different way, which is causing me a lot of anxiety about it's not quite exactly the same. I'm not having I have some clinical applications, but not maybe as much as some other people. So I guess in terms of my reference letter, I do have a couple people that I think can speak to some of that. But when you kind of talked about omitting your supervisor, which I am including my old PhD supervisor, but in the interim, since I finished my PhD, I had another job. Would it be a huge red flag to not include that other person if it's my most recent employer, but maybe wasn't as relevant? Or is there
I mean, I'm not a program director, but I guess it depends on what the job is. If that job was very medical physicsy, maybe, but if it wasn't particularly medical physicsy, let's say you took on a data analyst position at an advertising firm or something.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not going to be as much of a big thing versus, especially, I think, as somebody coming out of a graduate degree, the person who should know them the best is basically been their boss or supervisor for the last 2 to 7 years. Okay. So I don't think it's as much of a red flag. I think provided the people you are picking are recent enough and can still speak to you well, I think is probably the one thing.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm not trying to get too specific. And thank you guys for the talk. It was great and really helpful and answered a lot of my questions. But yeah, I was previously a postdoc, but in kind of a weird field that I kind of just landed in because of COVID. So it was still researchy, but like nothing really in the medical physics side. So I'm kind of, yeah, trying to figure out who that third reference person would be, and if it's going to be a red flag to not include that one kind of old boss that maybe.
I mean, straight up, if you're not sure and you have a program director that you would be comfortable reaching out to, ask them. Just
Okay.
honestly, a lot of people in physics around here and a lot of program directors are pretty chill. And if you're just cards on the table, would you be comfortable telling me this? They can refuse and say, no, I'm not comfortable. That's it. Like, a lot of people are happy to give advice.
Thanks.
So we also have a question in the chat from Paula, and that is there any advice for an applicant with a PhD outside of medical physics, but with a CampEp one-year certificate? Oh, actually, this is pretty much the same kind of question. So Paula, hopefully that answered it before. Farley's question, hopefully that answered it. Masvita had a question, which is, so thank you for the wonderful talks. I was wondering if your chances of getting selected for a residency program are higher if you have a PhD as compared to a master's degree, and any advice for an international applicant seeking to study in Canada and do a residency there?
So I mean, I'll be straight up with this answer. Yes, if you have a PhD, your chances at getting a residency position are higher. That's just a reality. However,
data backed is a little bit harder to say, but there's way more positions available to you if you have a PhD. There's a lot of programs that are looking PhD only or prioritized PhDs, but there are some in the States. And based on 2023 matched candidates, there was not a statistically significant difference between those with masters and those with PhDs, based on our data that we've collected.
Okay,
but
so
you have more opportunities.
Yeah, I think and what I was going to say is that if you don't have a PhD, but for example, you have a master's and you have excellent soft skills and, other desirable skills, you're still perhaps more likely to get the position than somebody with a PhD. So don't sell yourself short. So go for all the positions that you want. And I know in Canada, there's historically less positions in residency. I feel like our field is really expanding, so maybe it's different now. But in the US, there's typically a lot of positions. So, as Dr. Patrick said, it probably doesn't even matter anymore if you're applying to American schools. But
I mean, at least do read up on the schools, make sure that they do accept master's applicants, because some don't.
As for international applicants, I'm just wondering, to the person who asked the question, so where are they coming from and what degree do they have? Have they done like any CampEp accredited courses here in Canada, or is there just a little bit more information?
Yeah, because I will speak briefly to that. Obviously, I'm not coming from an international background, but I do know that several residency programs, for instance, a lot in Ontario, are funded by the government, but the funding is conditional on those training positions going to people with Canadian residencies, Canadian permanent residence statuses, or Canadian citizenship statuses. And the programs are not necessarily going to get that funding if it is an international candidate hired. So that's just an unfortunate reality of how some of the salaries are funded for residencies in certain provinces. So again, it pays to contact the program directors and reach out whether or not they consider international applicants or not. But that is something where you might run into issues where certain provinces or certain programs, even if you are the best candidate, for funding reasons, they might not be able to take you on.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say as well that, so I'm not an international candidate. What I've been told by people who've come from other countries is that the quickest way to become a physicist in Canada is to do the 1-year certificate program and apply for residency from there. So And I think this is because depending on where you're coming from, a lot of the courses are not recognized. So that's why I was kind of asking whoever asked the question, you know, if their courses are CAMPEP, if they're recognized by CAMPEP, then it's a bit of a different situation than if they're not. So I know for a lot of applicants where they were coming without CAMPEP recognized courses, but they had a PhD, for example, then doing the 1-year certificate was able to kind of get them in the CAMPEP, you know, club or whatever you want to call it. And then they were able to apply to residency from there.
And what I was going to say, in Ontario, I do know of one case where an international student, they completed their PhD in Canada, but they did get a residency, but they had to secure funding from their government, so not the Canadian government. And so and the stipulation was upon completion of their residency, they went back. They went back home, but again, that's a very specific case, and you'd have to again talk to the program director if that's something that they'd be willing to do. And you'd have to secure funding by yourself, which could be a challenge in of itself.
Yeah, and regarding a similar kind of question, do you know if there's any Canadian programs that sponsor international applicants? I admittedly don't. Reach out to program directors is my best advice is about that. If it's not clearly disclosed on the websites, reach out. You're not going to know otherwise, and you want to make sure you're actually applying to places that you have a good chance at, so you don't waste your time and effort, I would say.
Yeah, so the take-home message there is for specific questions, each center is probably different. Reach out to them directly and you'll get a direct answer probably. So how is asking a question for the panelists, who are the decision makers in the selection committee, or how are rankings usually made?
Rankings made by students or rankings made by the program directors?
Based off the question, I'm going to assume he's referring to from the program side of things.
Well, I mean, we're not program directors, so we can only guess. But I'll pull up. I have data on what the selection committees look like, actually, or the interviewing committees at least. But do Mark or Clara want to talk to this briefly?
Honestly, again, if at a program level, I wish I could answer and be 100% accurate, but just to avoid giving inaccurate info, I'm not too sure.
I honestly, I'm not a program director either. I think it depends on the center. At some centers, it's a group of people. Honestly, I think it's very center specific.
Yeah. So guys, this is the magical medical physics spreadsheet. Here is all the data from 2023 for a bunch of programs we asked people to provide who are the interviewers / panelists. And we have a nice breakdown at the bottom in terms of the percentage of programs that had different kind of interviewers on there. So basically all panels will have physicists. At least half of them tend to have a resident person on there too. And about half will have some dosimetrist / MD also making decisions in terms of whether they think you'd be a good fit as well. That it tends to be mainly physicists within the department deciding whether or not you're a good fit.
That's a very comprehensive list right there. Yeah.
This is
well,
this is one of my type A manic events during last year.
Interesting. So another question that we had, hopefully that answered that question. Another question that we had was, within your whole process of applying, what kind of were there any specific challenges that you faced just from a student perspective? So whether that was just having to wrap up your thesis quickly, or just different administrative issues, what kind of issues did you run into, if any?
Definitely that one.
Defense timelines.
Yeah.
Mark and I were both writing theses while we were interviewing.
I think it really helps to be done your experiments before you start the interview process. I know for me there was like a little bit of an overlap, and it was quite tough balancing all that. And so if I was to go back and do it again, I'd probably really work a little bit harder leading up to it, just so that I was a little bit less stressed. the other thing to keep in mind is a lot of centers in the US, and I think BC, their start date is July 1st. And Canadian ones, I think most of them on the match this year were September 1st. And so that was definitely a factor.
Ontario
that
at
also,
least is basically all September, yeah.
Yeah, Ontario was September 1st, and I think Calgary was as well.
I'll go pull it up and check and see if it's on there.
I'm not sure. But that also definitely influenced how influenced my ranking list in that I defended in August and for a start date in September. And looking back, if I probably could have done it in earlier, but it would have really stressed me out. So that's something. It was definitely balancing my PhD work.
Like I will say, I did not have the best timeline stress-wise. If you can have it, so you submit your initial thesis by the end of February, if not earlier, and be able to defend by the end of April, if you're doing it all in the same year, highly recommend. That was not mine. There was stress.
And did that defense kind of timeline significantly sort of not alter, but let's say like influence your decision to go to a Canadian center?
At least for me, yes, because of visas in my timeline.
I like for me, it definitely did contribute to it. I think I did also genuinely want to stay in Canada. But it definitely was a factor influencing it, but it wasn't the only one.
Yeah, similar in that regard.
I defended right when COVID was happening, so I had ideas about going to the States, but it was a total disaster at the time. So staying in Canada was very attractive.
I think the other nice thing as well is since COVID now, most of the interviews are virtual, and hopefully it stays that way, because it was quite I imagine it'd be quite a challenge traveling to all the different centers, whilst also trying to do your PhD or master's.
Also very expensive.
Yeah.
For graduate students, I always thought that was a little bit of a unreasonable expectation to have of grad students.
And spend a couple $1,000s flying around all of North America, yeah.
Well, thanks for everyone, the questions and the panelists. Do you guys have any one last quick question? If not, okay. If not, we will end the session here. Let me share. Oops. So thanks for the panelists, and also thanks the moderators, Omar and me. And just so some housekeeping items, if you're interested in the C3 seminars, please sign up for the email by scanning this QR code here. We're posting the future seminar events on the social media, also through the emails. And thank you, everyone.
And also just to highlight a comment by our chair, Ali. Past sessions are accessible on our YouTube channel. So if you want to see those you can visit our YouTube channel as well. You can also just type in Comp Student Council. It'll all come up.
Yeah, and I will say, if you're thinking about residencies, there's a really great one put on by Titania Jung and Stuart Gady, who were two program directors last year. So that was very helpful for me last year. So if you can get access to that, do it.
Awesome.
Good luck, everyone, with your applications.
Yeah. Don't stress too much, hopefully. Don't be me.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye.